You're muted. Hi, Nicolee, Roshi. Nice to see you.
So it gives me great joy to introduce my teacher to you. I'm so happy she's here and you can get to know her a little better. Uh, this is Nicolee Jikyo McMahon Roshi. She's one of 12 successors of Taizan Maizumi Roshi. She received Dharma transmission from him in 1995. She co-founded the Three Treasures Zen community in San Diego, where she works as a psychotherapist. She's semi-retired, but she still leads retreats. She's trained in Genpo Roshi's Big Mind process, and she started what she calls the practice of immediacy in the arts, which is an innovative way of bringing creativity into Zen practice by opening yourself to the present moment. And those of you that have come to any of our 7-day retreats will be familiar with this process because we practice it here at our Zen Center. Nicolee Roshi has 7 successors, of which I am one. And I'm going to hand it over to Roshi.
Okay, let's see, I muted myself.
No, you're good.
Okay, good. It says here, Zoom's doing something, so I'm going to press with these. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So it's my pleasure to be here and to meet with you all. It's a strange time, and Joshin, Roshi, and I talked about what my topic would be, and I want to get onto gallery view here. And I thought it might be good to really have more of a conversation because there's so much happening, and it feels to me like it's going to get a bit rough over the next several weeks. So we're beginning to see a little bit of that happening now. So I really wanted to open the space to have a conversation and see where we go. I'm more interested. I like to do live talks where I ask what you're interested in, and then I'll talk about it, and to go back and forth rather than have something be more distant. And but I want to start with a couple of things first off, and then we'll open it up to the conversation. First place, I want to thank Michael Bruner for taking on this position that you've taken on. And it's very, I'm grateful that the Sangha understands, or maybe is learning, that when you run a Zen center, the people who are in a teaching position need to have the short list of things to do. And the reason for that is because the teachers are carrying more the vision, and they need the time to be able to be a resource for others, but really to have the short list of things to do. And I know both June and Joshin have been juggling many balls at once. So the shift that is going on right now, I personally am grateful for, because I know how hard it can be to run a Zen center, and especially with one of such wonderful programs that you have. And you have 2 wonderful teachers, and you're very lucky. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The other thing was, in these kinds of times, it's really important, from my view, to cultivate compassion within and without. And the 4 vows that you have: creations are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to transform them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to open them. And the awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. If you gotta get lost in what's happening right now, it's helpful just to come back to those four vows. They're very grounding, very, very grounding. Kind of reminds you about possibilities. And when we're in a narrow time, it's hard to see possibilities, but they're everywhere. Abundance is everywhere. You can look at the air and the nature and ground and sunlight and simple things of the everyday life. So I encourage you to work with that compassion right now, both directions. And everything is actually Dharma. Sometimes that's hard to swallow, but there is a really a Wansong who is, if you're interested in the Book of Equanimity, I'll get the word out, Book of Equanimity, it's also called a Shoyoroku. Wansong has a statement in there where he says, all throughout the universe, everything becomes food. All throughout the universe, everything becomes food. So all of the situations that we're dealing with right now at so many levels, how do we practice with that? How do we open to what life is bringing forth right now? And I want to read you, pull it up, give me a sec. For some of you might have heard this, others of you may not have, but this is a Hopi message. The Hopi, is everybody familiar with the Hopi Native Americans?
Yeah.
Okay. You have been telling people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell them this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing with your life? How are your relationships doing? Are you in right relation with those around you? It is time to speak your truth, to create your community. Be good to each other and look within to find your guide. This could be a good time. There is a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and so swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shore. They will feel they are being torn apart, and they will suffer greatly. Be there for them and know that the river has its destination. The elders say that we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, and keep our eyes open and our head above the water. See who is in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do, our spiritual journey comes to a halt. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in the sacred manner and in celebration. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So this is from the elders from Oribe, Arizona, Hopi Nation. And I often like to read that. The groundedness of the indigenous people helps remind us about this incredible earth that we live on that is so full of possibility and treasures. So, okay. let's just kind of open and see what comes forth for you to share and or to ask questions. There's anything I can be of service to you. And I don't know how you do this. Do you just have the person unmute?
Yes, Roshi, you can just call on people. They can raise their hand or just speak up. We don't really have a system.
So go ahead, raise your hand. I actually can't see everybody because there are two sheets here. So
One way is for someone to just start talking, and then you'll hear them
okay,
too.
great. So it's up to you all now. Step forward.
I'll break the wall down here. This is Shishin. Such a pleasure to meet you, Roshi. Can you see me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Yesterday, my wife was telling me about I guess a childhood friend that she has, who she's still in contact with on Facebook, who's extremely right of our position. And we were talking about how difficult it is to communicate. And I said, why don't you just say to her, look, let's just start listening to each other or something like that, I think I said. And she said, she's always been this way and it won't change. And I wonder whether you've got some comments about, it caused me to think about that story in Dogen about Dangshan, I think it is, who hits Jishan with the oar, and it's all about Jishan wanting to talk too much rather than just listening. And I think maybe we need to listen, but it's difficult. I wonder if you can comment.
Certainly, thank you. I think it's a question that all of us are dealing with in some form. And thank you for bringing it up. I want to see this gallery view. So you know how in Zen we have this way of looking at things about the appropriate time, the appropriate place, the appropriate person, the appropriate amount, kind of what fits the situation. And I do two things when I'm in that kind of a situation. I remember that because it may be the wrong time. So you have to do some intuitive sorting about that. I also remember that this is the Buddha I'm talking with. And this is the Dharma that's being shared. And that's, for me, very helpful because then you see the other person and it can give you the space to listen if it is the right time. For example, somebody who's always been extremely certain, in times of uncertainty, that desire for certainty will get usually stronger. And of course, from practice, we know that everything's uncertain all the time. We may forget it, but that's the way it is when we really examine each moment unfolding. I don't even know what I'm going to say next. Things emerge. So it can help to tell the other person what you're hearing them say. That creates resonance between people in the sense that the other person you don't have to agree with, but you can hear them. And it takes a lot of inner work because you may feel triggered. You may feel like your cortisol is just rushing around. You may feel some feelings of threat or even fears that come back to your breath. The breath's very stable. Come back to feeling your feet on the floor. The simplicity of the everyday things, even just reminding yourself, wait a minute, am I safe right now? And you look around and you see, yeah, I'm safe right now. You really work with yourself. You have to ground yourself in the middle of that discomfort about listening to the other whose views are so different from your own. So I find that, as I said, if you can remind yourself that what's going on is Dharma, this is the Buddha. This is the Buddha who really wants certainty and is holding on like that. And then you can wonder, I wonder what caused that incredible desire for certainty. I wonder what kind of fear she's carrying. So it's a kind of stepping back and putting, right now, we're going to be called to put our practice into practice at a level we've not had to do before, in my view. I was just curious this morning what's happened now that things are going in the direction of Biden becoming president, being the president-elect, and then what's happening for President Trump and the conspiracy theories and all of that. So how do we find stability in the middle of very rapid motion? That's why I read the Hopi prayer to you, because it gives another view. Actually, it's called the Hopi Message. It gives another view about being in this rapid river right now. And we're all here. This is our time. How are we showing up? So it's going to be a time of a lot of practice. I encourage you to stabilize your daily practice. If you start the morning sitting, it's very helpful because you're creating a reset in a sense for your body. And if some of you don't yet have a daily practice, at least check your breath throughout the day. Okay, I'm breathing. Come back to your breath. I also encourage you, I think, Joshin, you've taught them about the tenets of the Zen peacemaker. This not knowing, bearing witness, and
Yes.
there's a healing action that comes out of not knowing and bearing witness. That's very, very helpful. And I participated in an online Auschwitz retreat. It was started last Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And we were, for those of you who've done this retreat, you've seen the images Marion did of the Holocaust. And they're drawings that are, there's a whole story behind, I won't go into, but they're drawings of his experience from the age of 17 when he went into Auschwitz. And when I saw the drawings, the first thing I wanted to do was run. I wanted to bolt. Julie was there, I think, weren't you, Julie? Yeah. I wanted to bolt. My whole body was just, this is overwhelming. This is too much. And so I named it Overwhelm. And then came back to the breath. And then I was able to bear witness to the horror of it. Afterwards, there was a listing of names of people who died in the Holocaust. And then during that time period, I had my eyes shut as I was listening to the names, and I had this image of these Holocaust victims walking through this museum where the images were held. And an amazing thing happened. There was, as they were looking in my imagination. And they had this experience of somebody's bearing witness to my pain, to my suffering. Then what I saw happen was a light fill the victims, and a light began to fill the whole museum, and a light began to fill me. I could give you a lot of stories about that, about what happened. The experience of bearing witness to the suffering of the world also brings up the joy. And how do we hold that? So another skillful means is to practice with not knowing, bearing witness to the joy and suffering of the world. And then see if there's a healing action that comes out of it. A very simple one is the one you talked about, which is listening. How do we listen? I find the best way to listen is to listen so well that you can hear what the other person is saying, and you can tell them, what I'm hearing you say is, and I know you do the NVC training, so you've got that as a practice. Telling the other what you're hearing them say, they feel heard. And maybe this friend's never been really heard. And so being heard, even though you don't agree with anything she's saying, and you continue you've probably seen in NVC, as you continue to tell the person what you're hearing them say, they usually start to settle down a bit and get a bit less defensive. And if that doesn't happen and you feel you're too flooded, you can always say, well, thank you so much. I notice I'm got a lot going on with me. I need to think about what you're saying, or some way to disengage, because you need to do self-care too. Does that make sense? Does that fit?
Roshi, I'd like to ask the question in a slightly different way, because we're all on social media, and we don't, especially in the pandemic, we're not necessarily having a lot of face-to-face conversations with people. So I had this experience of, I somehow became friends with an artist on Facebook, and I was attracted to him because he was an artist, he was a creative person, and I realized he's probably a lot younger than me. And then when I looked at his Facebook page, it was all about not voting. And, he had this kind of, his point of view about the world was really as that everything is corrupt, so it doesn't matter who you vote for. And I wanted to have a conversation with him, but I didn't know how to start. I still don't know how to start it, because it's social media and it's so fraught. It's just, there's no body language, and I just wanted to talk to him. I wanted to learn about his point of view and have a conversation, and yet it doesn't feel like there's a space for that to happen, or I'm thinking there isn't. Maybe I just need to try, but I found that to be a kind of, I came up against something and I didn't know how to engage with someone I didn't really know on a Facebook page. It just feels really challenging to me.
I think it's really important what you're bringing up. The problem for me in something that's written, so something on Facebook, it's so limiting. We're so big as people. So if it's only in writing, people can project anything and everything onto what you said. But an invitation to see if the person be willing to Zoom with you, so that you can interact and go back and forth, and not have it narrowed to just words where a lot of projection goes on. And then if he doesn't want to do it, then it's like, okay, this is again, if you play with the idea of this is the Buddha, this is the non-voting Buddha. If you look at a smorgasbord, it's certain foods you may not want to eat. It may give you bad digestion, but at least you can see it.
Well, it may not be the right time or place, but
Yeah.
you can try. Yeah.
You can try. But I'd always aim to do it in some kind of live way.
Inviting someone to Zoom is a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something I've done, because I have a lot of friends that their political views are very different than mine, totally different. And I always want to ask them about, where their beliefs are rooted in. And something that I find that is helpful is if I make the conversation first be about the things that we have in common,
Mhm.
and then slowly start, asking a little bit more about their beliefs. And I feel like starting the conversation that way feels more organic and just more natural, and like you don't really have an agenda behind what you're trying to discuss. But I run into the same issue as well, because there's people that I really look up to, and they just, their world is totally different. And I've noticed that that's something that works, because what's surprising is how much we have in common despite our differences. And I think that's something that I try to never lose a hold of, those similarities. And I try to not let like the media or like politics, divide like this like beautiful relationship that we have. So it's tough, but I think it's something to consider.
Mhm. Thank you, Christian. I think it's a beautiful way to begin finding that common ground, because you're connecting and you're in relationship. When I went to Tanzania, this was 2004, I think. Before I went, there was a book called Taboos Around the World. And in that book, they listed the different cultural, some of the different cultural values. And one of them was, when you're in Tanzania, if you're talking with a person and you need to ask them for directions, you need to get into relationship first. And if you don't get into relationship first, you will not get the directions. So how you get in relationship is there's an exchange of three. This is what the book said at the time. So you say, I'm going to ask for, say, directions. And then you'd say, hello, how are you? How's your day going? And then there's going to be a response. It's usually a similar thing. And then a third response that would fit that situation. And then you ask for the directions. You ask for a need that you have, that they might be able to help you with. When I did this, I was thinking of one particular man. There weren't clear street signs. It was hard to get around. I was on my own at that particular time. He walked me there. He went out of his way to be sure I got there, because we were related. But when I first went up to him, he listened, but he was a little bit distant. Once that relatedness, that common ground was there, it was much easier to respond. And to me, that being in relationship is a very key element. Of course, you have to see if the other person is willing. And in your case, they're friends. And so you find that common ground, and then you become curious. And that curiosity is, to me, a very essential part of being human. When we get curious, we start to sort for possibilities instead of narrowing. And when people feel connected with, there's much more openness, is what I find. Yeah, I think that's a very, from my view, very healthy approach. I'll tell you another story that I think really fits here. One time in my work, two brothers came in to work, and they were running a company, and they were having terrible problems. The problems they were having were they were constantly fighting. And so I gave each one of them, I needed to find out what their values were, and I asked them a series of questions and had them write their answers down. And it became very obvious that underneath they wanted the same thing. They wanted to be able to have food, shelter, love, caring, stabilities in their life, enough to, money to be able to live well. And it went kind of basic values. What they were arguing about was how to get there. And of course, we know there's not a steady place to get to, but there is a relative way. There is a way that people can have shared values and really work through how to bring those values forward. They had never gone deep enough to find the shared values, which is what you're describing, Christian, is to find that shared values, where those shared values are. And that takes an inner discipline. I'm imagining that you had to work to find, I don't know, can you maybe say a little bit more about how you came to staying connected to where are the shared values? What was your inner way of getting there?
I always try. I mean, it's most of the interaction has been on social media, and I always just find a common interest, whether it's something that they posted, or even just a question that I have, or like a memory, or like a response to something they post, and it's always, yeah, it's always just based on like a common interest or like a mutual friend, things like that. So I use that as kind of like the catalyst for like probing into
How do you find that within
how do I find that with them.
you?
I,
How do you get there?
I think with me, I'm just naturally curious. Like I'm probably overly curious. Yeah, I just love people and like getting to know them, and when it comes to that, like I love asking questions and just, yeah, for me it's very easy because that's just my nature.
But you said it beautifully. You became curious.
Yeah.
And curiosity allows something to happen within us. Like, I'm really curious about how you became curious. So that starts to open up this field. Oh, okay. How did that happen? So he found curiosity within himself and he brought it forward and brought it into the relationship. The curiosity is a wonderful aspect of being human.
Mhm.
I tell you a story. When I was 12 years old, I don't know how this happened, but I began to ask myself the question, what does it mean to be a human being? So it became a personal koan for me. And it activated a curiosity about that. And for those of you who do koan practice, you need some big time curiosity to be able to do the practice. So I kept that question going. About right before my 21st birthday, an answer popped up. And the answer was to include everything. And that became like a torch that guided me through the rest of my life. And that include everything has within it that being curious doesn't mean I have to like everything, but I can be curious about it. Like, we're in a really tight time right now, tenuous time right now on so many levels. And if I become curious about both that tightness and whatever its opposite is, pairs of opposites rise together. Because we can get too narrow in one direction and then miss, okay, what is that? For me, the opposite of that tightness is expansion. But it could be different for each one of you. So then I might look, okay, what's the quality of the experience of expansion? And do something, look at it in a very simple way, like taking a really deep breath and then exhaling. So to come to more of the simple things of everyday life, and again, bringing that curiosity that you so beautifully talked about. Oh, his head is there. That was a curiosity. That's very cool. Do that again. That is so cool. Is that your head?
When I started my new job, I tried going the opposite route of having a portrait, so I shot the back of my head, and that became my professional headshot.
That's fun. Thank you. I'll show you mine in a second.
Nice.
Thank you. Anybody else?
This is Mark,
Hi, Mark.
and I've always been challenged by the Christian viewpoint when Jesus said, "Love your enemies," and that takes a certain, compassionate way to be. When in fact, at times you will not only disagree but have feelings towards people that you could say you're enemies with.
Mhm.
And I've been reading a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he really emphasizes a lot how we are connected with everything, and that would include other humans, regardless of our differences. But we're, might say, more alike than different. Though the differences tend to get the headline rather than what we have in common. I imagine if one was able to sit down long enough and have an empathic communication with an enemy, or for me, a Republican, someone who was a very strong follower of Trump, that we might find some common values, like you were talking earlier, that we'd share in common. But it might be hard to get there because of the obstacles on both sides of feeling, sort of there's the enemy, and they're wrong, they're bad, they're worthy of my hate, so to speak.
So how do you practice with that?
That's a good question. How do I practice with that? So I try to interact with everyone I come in contact with without assumptions or judging, and just treat all people with respect and kindness and compassion. So I'm sure I've met Republicans, but I don't know that they were. I had no idea they might have been that. But I take the Bodhisattva vow seriously. That is the desire to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. So I'm sure I'm going to be encountering suffering Republicans right now. And so I guess I'm going to do my best to just listen and try to understand and just be present with them in some way that they can feel understood, heard, and listened to. That's my aspiration.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I think it's a beautiful thing you're bringing up. If you take the image of a big garden, do you garden at all?
I don't, but I have plants that I nurture.
Okay. So imagine a garden. I don't know if all of you know this, but Joshin and June had incredible gardens in Hawaii. And they were, I hope, did you all know about that? About their garden? Great. If those of you don't know, be sure to ask them because it's wonderful what they did. But if you have a very big garden, you're going to have weeds and snails and ants, sometimes termites. You're going to have roses. Sometimes those roses have big pricks on them. There may be some cactus growing. If you just imagine the garden of the world that we live in, and some things are so prickly that you have to pay attention to what's the right distance. So let me give you an example of what I mean. My sense is that there's going to be a huge amount of grief. And say from the Republicans, depending how things unfold. And in grief, there are these stages. I'm just going to name them. I'm sure you already know them. But in the beginning, there's denial and shock and numbness. And then the next stage, and they don't go sequentially, but it's a spiral, but eventually go through all these stages if you go through a whole cycle of grief. The next stage can be anger and bartering, in the sense of, look, if I do, people will say, for example, if I do this, then there's attempts at retrieval, getting back what was. And then the next stage is where the real grief is. And a lot of people will avoid the grief by hanging on to anger. But as they go through the grief, and that's where depression can happen, hopelessness. It's a real dropping down and coming to terms with, I no longer have what I had. And then as one goes through that, one reorients and begins to find more again in their life and new possibility. It's this anger stage that you're going to need to, from my view, let me just speak about me. If somebody is in a high anger stage with big pricks, and I need to be in relationship with them. For example, this was my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was a Rush Limbaugh Republican. And she was a great teacher for me. She's a very prickly lady. And so one of the things that I needed to do was to remind myself to breathe and not take personally what she was saying or doing, but have a clear boundary. Because you have to take care of yourself in that situation. So loving could also be a loving kindness towards yourself and finding the right time, the right place, the right person. In my case, it was the right amount. So I knew with my mother-in-law, who lived to be 101, and she was a very cool lady. I admired her, but I had to learn how to dance with her. And she didn't know how to dance very well with people, what she thought she spoke. And so she was very, very prickly. So I had this visual imagery. I asked myself, what kind of plant would she be if she were a plant? And I saw that prickliness in her. And then I said, oh, there's a certain distance that I need to be mindful of when she gets prickly. She wasn't always prickly, of course, but it was I had to respect her style that was very foreign from my way of being. And then look for those areas of common ground that Christian was talking about and that you're talking about, Mark, so that we don't get, for me, not get caught up in too much of an ideal or an idea, but how to stay in relationship with somebody who, in my case, it was really important for me to stay in relationship with her because I wanted my stepson to really have access to his grandmother. That was my deeper value. And I want to read you something that the Dalai Lama said. The ultimate source of a happy life is the attention we pay to our inner values. The ultimate source of a happy life is the attention we pay to our inner values. And your inner value of the Bodhisattva vows was giving you some ways of moving through this and talking with people who might be in a very different place than you are. And also, I think, as I said, we're going to find a lot of grief. If my mother-in-law were still alive, she'd be really angry right now. And she'd be scared underneath that anger. Would be a lot of fear. And the stories that are out there right now that she'd be listening to, in her case on the radio or TV, would be filling her with fear that would be fueling her anger. So in my case, if she were alive and going to visit her, I'd probably bring her something she loved. She loved a certain kind of candy. So I'd go and try to create more room for the possibility for us to communicate. So again, that's going to be according to time, place, person, and amount. So you can play with these things. The ideal of loving one's neighbor is a beautiful place to come to. Loving one's enemy, rather. It'd be a beautiful place to come to and to practice with. And then to keep learning from that, bringing that curiosity, bringing your vows in, and then playing with time, place, person, and amount. If you're really tired, like I knew if I was really tired, that was not a time to go visit my mother-in-law. That was my form of self-care. Does that make sense? I can't hear you. I can't hear you, Mark.
Okay, so if you're not in a good place, it's pretty hard to relate in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you very much. The idea of people being in grief is a important way to understand their experience. Whether that be anger right now, I imagine anger is the first reaction probably going to be happening right now.
Yeah, from what I heard this morning, it's there pretty strongly. And then listen for the fear underneath the anger.
Mhm.
You know, you learn in nonviolent communication that most anger is because somebody has a need that they imagine is never going to be met.
Mhm.
And that's how it self-perpetuates. But there's a fear underneath that. I have a need, how's it going to be met? And the opposite side's being demonized, then you really can't imagine your needs are going to be heard or valued or met.
Yeah. I think Biden has and Kamala have done a fairly good job of not demonizing Trump. They have called him out on his behavior, but I think so far I like the way they have been an example, even in the humble way he accepted, that he won. He didn't attack Trump or anything during that whole thing. So I think, we have someone who's going to be a good example for us.
Yeah. It's a good model.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, did you want to say something? You're unmuted, so I thought maybe you had something.
Oh yeah, I just, I'm not really in contact with anybody who's a Trump supporter. I'm in a pretty much, kind of Oak Park liberal bubble. Everybody I know is just completely with Biden and doesn't have anything to do with that. So, but I'm really concerned about, reaching out and trying to build a bridge to those people, because I do think they're, well, anyway, it's partly their own fault, but they're very afraid and angry and disappointed. And I just want to welcome them back to reality, and to the country and the community that we live in. But I don't know what to do.
What's your instinct? What's your deep intuition, your deep knowing telling you?
The only thing I can do really is, when my family and friends are talking about like saying angry things about Trump supporters, just kind of remind them like, well, these people are afraid. These people are listening to media that tells them. So like sort of work on the people that I do come into contact with and trying to communicate with them about being open and being loving.
How would you do that?
Just to remind them that that Trump supporters are, that they're actual human beings, that they have feelings, they have values. Like when we got really angry about, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, being replaced by Barrett on the Supreme Court, and just like, oh, the people who vote for her are terrible. It's like, no, these people really think that they're saving babies. We don't agree with them, but that's what they think they're doing. So just try to look at things from the other person's perspective.
So you're bringing more equanimity into the situation.
Yeah, I guess.
Reminds me of a story. This was years and years ago. My first husband's sister married a man who was very prejudiced, and they lived in Alaska. He was also a wonderful guy, and we were at their place visiting with two young children at the time, who are now 51 and 47, which is amazing to consider. But at the time, my brother-in-law was talking about his terms, all the slang for people of different ethnic backgrounds and races. And every time he would make, like he'd say, the Japs, or I'm trying to remember what the other ones were, the Japs, the Spics, he spoke like that. He didn't see up people, he just named them in this category. And my whole body would be going whenever he said these things. And I thought, we're out in the middle of the boondocks. We've come up to see them. How am I going to handle this? And I came back to the Bodhisattva vow to kind of get myself grounded. And then it dawned on me. I took it as a koan, and I started sitting in with it, into it. And whenever he'd use the term, I'd say, oh, you mean the Japanese people? Oh, you mean the Mexican people? oh, you mean the Black people? Whatever term he'd throw at, it was just a very subtle, nuanced kind of reframe. And after a while, he stopped using that language because there wasn't a confrontation going on. It's just I needed to be able to show up and not have his opinion swamp things. I needed to find a way how to get more into be in relationship, but without making him wrong. And I didn't know if that was going to work, but it's just something I needed to say to survive, frankly, in the environment. And it actually worked. Where'd that come from? It came from looking into this question and breaking it down, which is what you just talked about, how you went about breaking it down so that you could talk with your friends and give another point of view and so a point of view that they'd lost connection with, that this is a human being with their own values. The Trump supporters, a human being with their own values, their own way of perceiving things. And you brought differentiation in instead of, no, you can only be like me. There was that space for seeing the differences and allowing those differences to be there without having to slam the person down in order to be right or in order to say, no, my opinion is the correct one. So learning to live with differences, which is such a foundation to our country. How do we live with differences and negotiate our values? And we're in a beautiful position right now to put everything we've learned into practice, and we're going to fail. So make room for that. You're not going to get it right every time. You're going to fail, and you can always say, hey, I'm so sorry, I didn't get it right. I know you're studying Delangelo's book, White Privilege, and I took a webinar with her, and I appreciated, have you, any of you seen her participate in a webinar with her? D'Angelo is about white privilege. She's really open about talking. When she messes up, she owns it. And I think that owning can be very helpful. Just know you're going to mess up. We're in new territory as a country, as a people, and we're having to shift and learn new ways of relating. And we've got all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories going on, which people grab for during times of uncertainty because it makes them feel certain, but they're crazy ideas in many cases. So how do we have empathy for that and still stand for, I sure don't see it that way. I see it this way. So that differentiation that can bring in another point of view, which is what you're describing, is how you're going about doing that. And we're each going to have to find our own way. I like to use the nonviolent communication. I think it's very skillful. Using the bodhisattva vows, remembering that this is the Buddha I'm talking to. How do you treat them with respect? Time, place, person, amount. So there are a lot of different ways that you can pull yourself back, breathe. Breath is always there. It's really helpful. But I do think that if you can come also back to your own joy, what brings you joy? And give yourself a good dose of that on a daily basis. It could be some form of creativity. It could be exercise. It could be getting together with a friend. It can be meditation. It can be learning. I decided during the pandemic to study singing. And so I took a singing class and I got more and more interested in it. Now I'm in 3 different singing groups that meet Monday night, Wednesday afternoon, and Saturday afternoon. And yesterday, when all this was happening, when Biden had been declared the winner, there were 330 people in this singing group. And there was this joy that was coming through. And this joy of singing is really cool. And part of the reason why I took singing group was because I sing so badly. So I wanted to learn what to do with my voice. And, you know, with Zoom, you can get on Zoom and take all these courses. So I started to learn how to sing, and now my poor husband has to hear me sing throughout the day. But that was the thing that was bringing joy for me. So for me, some form of creativity is really important. And right, you know, I like to paint and do that. But each moment of our life is creative. Cooking, gardening, loving your children or people you live with. That's very creative. So you find I encourage everybody to what brings you joy in a simple, everyday way to help nourish that inside of you so that you have a way to ground yourself. You can have some fun. The joy will activate more your compassion. And it helps really help you appreciate the simplicity of your everyday life. I just saw it's 9, or my time, it's noon your time. So boy, the time passed fast.
Roshi, we have reached the end of the hour, and I want to thank you so much. This was just so appropriate and helpful, I think, at this moment. And I particularly like that story you told about Tanzania, because I think there's something about relationships. It's not about either person. It's what takes place in between. And it's that resonating. And that was such a lovely story you told, because unless we take the time to resonate, to be connected, then we're like two objects, and then we're like this. But if we could, it was so obvious to me the other day that Vanessa was over with David, and it's not about the baby or the mother. It's so obvious. It's what's between them that's taking place. It's so precious and wonderful. And I particularly like ending on a note of joy. Because there's so much suffering. We often feel guilty for having happiness or joy, but oh my gosh, let's have some joy.
Yeah, have some fun, have some joy. That'll help you get through this. Thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you, Roshi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take good care of yourselves.
Brian, you had a funny quote there, a funny thing he said. He said he wanted an autographed copy of Roshi's Christmas album. Great one. Okay, see you all. Take care.